Good afternoon, everyone. See, we have a capacity crowd. Thank you very much. Thankfully, you'll be pleased to hear this is only a 20-minute presentation. I know it's the very end of the day, so we can probably get through this quite swiftly. My name is Harry Aujla. I'm a Partner Alliances Director at SIOS Technology. I'm sure many of you have not heard of SIOS before. We are specialists in high availability and disaster recovery for mission-critical applications and databases. So we're obviously here this week talking about SQL, but we do lots of other things as well. The idea of this presentation today is to take you through a real-world example of what one of our customers achieved through saving money on their SQL Server licenses costs by deploying a solution on SIOS. So we'll talk a little bit about sort of who the customer was, what kind of challenges they were facing, and the solution they ended up with. So we'll take about sort of 15, 20 minutes to do that. It'd be great if we could just sort of leave questions to the end. We'll have a bit of a Q&A session at the end. I've kindly put the barcode up on the header screen there. If you want to rate me, I'll put that up at the end as well. I don't accept anything less than 5 stars, just so that you know. So we can get going here. Let me just give you a quick intro to SIOS. As I said, we're specialists in high availability and disaster recovery. We've been around for quite a long time, 25 years we'll be celebrating this year, protecting all sorts of mission-critical applications and databases. We're a global organization headquartered in California, offices all around the world, as you can see there. But a lot of our success over those years has been via the kind of partners we kind of end up working with. As you can see there, I won't go through all of those, but you can see some major players we work with who all rely on our technology, not only as your technology they use themselves, but also what they recommend for their customers as well. What I want to do today is introduce you to one of our customers. I'm a little bit gutted. I wanted to name who this customer was, and I just couldn't get their approval in time for this event. So I have to behave myself and anonymize this use case. But I'll give you a little bit of a profile of who they are. They're a very, very large mass multimedia conglomerate based out of Canada. Huge revenues of over $6 billion. Trust me, if I mention the name, you'd know who they are. Very large organization. They're one of those organizations where they've sort of got their fingers in different pies. Yeah, they're largely known for their multinational news agency arm of the business, but they have various other arms as well, such as tax and accounting, legal, government, financial, and risk. And the part of the organization we actually work with very closely is that tax and accounting arm. So what I'm going to do is go through that sort of typical use case scenario. I'm going to sort of explain the challenge, what they were facing, what they were trying to do, the solution they ended up deploying, and then, of course, what they actually got out of it and what the benefits were out of what they deployed. So this was an organization, like many other organizations, who were sort of facing that possibility of a digital transformation into a cloud environment. And they decided, for various reasons, that they wanted to migrate a lot of their SQL Server estate into AWS. So this SQL Server estate was supporting a tax and accounting application that they were running called Lone Star. And they were running about sort of 300 to 400 different sort of SQL servers, as in actual servers. I can't remember how many SQL instances that was, but it was a lot. So they were thinking about how do we end up migrating that into AWS. What they were doing when they were running on-premise, they were relying on SQL Enterprise with SQL Server always on availability groups. And because of the number of databases they were running and the number of transactions needed through those databases, they were running some really high-core, high-end servers in their physical environment. And thinking about that transition into the cloud, that was concerning them a little bit, because if they had to do that in a cloud environment, that might start getting a little bit expensive. So they spoke with AWS. AWS were great. They gave them a couple of options. They said, look, yeah, you can continue using SQL Always On in the cloud. That's not a problem. But you will have to continue using SQL Enterprise licenses. And then we can base that on an FSX storage architecture within AWS. Now, FSX is sort of a shared storage architecture that AWS offer. The customer was a little bit concerned because obviously they wanted to get away from those expensive SQL Enterprise licenses, so they didn't really want to go up that road. And also they did actually do a bake-off between our solution and FSX as well, and actually found our solution performed a little bit better. So that's something that they were favoring. AWS also said, look, we've got managed services around SQL as well. So these are options as well if you want to bring your SQL estate into EC2. But these were sort of looking rather expensive as well. And given the size of the SQL estate the customer was dealing with, they kind of wanted to avoid some of these options. So they went away, they did their homework. I'm not sure how. They found SIOS, which was great. And I'll talk a little bit about what they actually ended up doing with SIOS. So just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what we do and just sort of set the context here, one of our capabilities is to configure and deploy what we call a SAN-less cluster architecture. So the name of that kind of sort of gives it away. It's basically a cluster architecture that doesn't rely on any shared storage or any shared resources. So the idea is that if you have a standard sort of cluster architecture, node 1, node 2, normally we'd have some sort of shared storage sitting there. But what we say is, get rid of that. That's a single point of failure. And let's now rely on the storage available to us on each of the cluster nodes. So what our solution does, Datakeeper, it creates a replication process between the two cluster nodes just to make sure that data is synchronized, and it presents it as a Datakeeper volume. And then we can present that Datakeeper volume up to the failover cluster as available storage. And there's a couple of benefits there. We've talked about removing that single point of failure, but also it now means you can sort of geo-relocate your cluster nodes as well. They don't necessarily have to be sitting on the same site. So what we see with our customers running our technology in the cloud, they end up sort of splitting their clusters across separate availability zones. And that's, again, just to avoid any single points of failure. So it's a really, really simple premise. It's not rocket science, but it works. Funnily enough, it also gives you the same availability SLA as SQL Always On. And I'll come to that in a moment. The other interesting thing here is that if we think about this from an AWS perspective, we don't need to consider an FSX storage architecture. So there's a potential cost there that you can avoid if you're not looking to leverage the full feature set of FSX. The other nice thing about our technology, we don't need large, huge, multi-core servers to run our software. So we can actually scale down the size of our instances in the cloud and save ourselves a bit more money there as well. Just to sort of show you what the customer did in a real-world scenario, here's an EC2 environment. You can see I've got 2 availability zones. And what they simply did is they built out a number of SQL clusters using our technology, where node 1 is sitting in AZ1 and node 2 is sitting in AZ2. The SIOS solution is simply replicating the data and logs of our SQL environment, and the failover cluster instance is still managing the cluster as it normally would between 2 availability zones. So the concept of clustering is the same. We've just sort of geo-relocated them to give you a more highly available solution. And that's the same for any cloud environment. Obviously, the example here is AWS. So what the customer wanted to do, they wanted to sort of deploy about 300 of these clusters in AWS. So quite a few that they're managing. And they really wanted to minimize the amount of SQL Server licensing costs that they wanted to deploy here. And they realized if they combined a failover cluster with the SIOS Datakeeper piece and run this on SQL Server Standard Edition, they can make a huge saving compared to running SQL Always On with SQL Enterprise Edition. So that was the main draw for this customer. But they also found a number of other advantages. They found that they were able to spin up their VMs really quickly and have Datakeeper pre-built into their build. So every time a part of the organization needed some SQL resource, they were just able to fire that up quickly, get that deployed, and make it highly available at the same time as well. as part of that build. So that's something that they really liked about SIOS. They like the fact that there's no limitation on the number of databases we could protect. They are running a huge number of databases across those 300 clusters. And they found that they didn't have to sort of horizontally scale that out if they ended up using SQL Enterprise and SQL Always On, which does have a limitation on the number of databases you can deploy per cluster. So that was very, very interesting for them. Just to big up the company a bit, no high availability solution is of any use unless you've got a world-class support network behind it as well. I think that's just as good as the high availability technology that we provide. And they were really pleased that we come out with a really high 97% satisfaction rating on our global support network, which is a 24/7 follow the sun model. As I mentioned, because of the way they ended up deploying our solution within their AWS environment, they ended up standardizing all of their SQL high availability purely on our solution. So that's now part of their standard SQL build, no matter where they end up deploying SQL clusters around the environment. But the real sort of headline here is as I sort of touched upon earlier, it's upon that license cost piece. Because they were able to move away from SQL Enterprise licenses and build the same availability SLA just using SQL standard licenses combined with the SIOS solution, they found themselves saving a really, really big amount of money, almost about 70% on their SQL Server licensing costs. So that starts becoming quite compelling, especially if you're running quite a large environment, no matter where that might be. And they also found that once they were running SQL Standard Edition, they didn't have to be running sort of large, big, multi-core instances as well. So they were saving money at an instance level as well in deploying this way. I've got a larger version of that chart there just so it's a bit more readable. But as you can see, the savings increase the bigger the systems are. So switching to SQL Standard with Datakeeper Cluster Edition. And if you sort of factor in things like software assurance, maintenance, and things like that, the net result for most of our customers is a saving of up to 70%. I'm not saying all of our customers do that, but there's potentially a saving to be made. So at the very least, it's certainly worth sort of having an initial conversation with us to see if we can help you in any way in that respect. So this is an example of what the customer was actually saving. So they wanted to embark on a new project where they were deploying new SQL instances in their environment. And they sort of compared the costs between what it would have costed from a SQL Enterprise perspective using SQL Always On, and compare that with SQL Standard with Datakeeper Cluster Edition. These are numbers the customer developed themselves. This is nothing that SIOS have put together. And what they found is that if they were sort of running 32 core systems running SQL Enterprise, a SQL Enterprise cluster, 2 nodes, was costing them about 40K. Whereas if you compare that with SQL Standard, it's about 10K per cluster. So there's a sort of a 75% saving there straight away. And their project, they were building out a new project. They realized they needed about 16 SQL Enterprise licenses if they were going to go up that road with SQL Enterprise. And had they done that with those number of clusters, it would have cost them 640K. When they looked at SQL Standard Edition and Datakeeper Cluster Edition, they realized they didn't need as many clusters because we could protect more databases per cluster. Obviously, the cost per cluster is lower on Standard Edition. That ended up costing about 60K. That particular project saved them 90% in SQL Server licensing costs. So for this particular customer, it was a bit of a no-brainer. Again, I'm not saying all of our customers are in the same position, but there's certainly a saving that can be made at some level. And just to sort of wrap up here, this is just a quick slide just to demonstrate some of our other capabilities. We've been talking about Datakeeper Cluster Edition and protecting SQL Server clusters. We actually have another Windows product. We come across some customers who are running applications that might not be Windows cluster aware, or they're running in environments where they're not running Active Directory domains. So Windows Server failover clustering is not going to work for them. So we actually have our own clustering technology as well, which we call Lifekeeper, and it works in exactly the same way as Windows clustering. It gives you the same benefits, but it's just an alternative Windows clustering solution that you can use for SQL if you need to. And we do get those groups of customers as well. And I'm seeing more and more of this. They're asking us for SQL on Linux as well. So we do actually have a Linux clustering solution as well, which has a SQL component to it as well, if that's interesting for you. That's it, guys. I was going to keep it short and sweet. I've been told to remind you about a few things. Firstly, if you've got any questions, if you want to come over and talk to us, we're downstairs, stand 11, next to gate 3. The team are down there, so if you've got any commercial questions, technical questions, we can help you. We're giving away some prizes. I'm sorry to say the Mandalorian helmet is gone. That went yesterday, but the Darth Vader is still up for grabs if you're interested in that. So come and speak to us, get your badge scanned. And I've been asked to remind you, how can you forget? There's the big bash tonight. So I hope we see everyone there tonight, fully dressed up and fancy dressed up. Probably won't recognize each other. And then just to finish up, if anyone does have any questions, happy to take those now. Like I said, if you want to rate my presentation, please do so. Scan the barcode, fill out the feedback form. I'm not lying. I don't take anything less than 5 stars, so just to let you know. But if anyone does have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer for those for you now.
When you talk about replicate the log and the data file, what kind of replication are you talking about?
So it's a block level replication process. So what it's doing, it's not actually looking at what the data is. It just knows what it's protecting. It recognizes what's changed, and it replicates that over to the other server. So it's efficient. That data keeper replication is about 20 years old. It's proven, and it works. And we actually use it for lots of different types of databases, not just SQL.
You do it in real time?
We do it in real time, and you can do it either synchronously or asynchronously. So what we find is when customers are doing that AZ to AZ setup in a cloud, usually they can do that synchronously. But if they want a third node for a DR purpose, which is perhaps somewhere else, another region, you can do that asynchronously. So we license it per cluster node.
From the original SQL licensing standpoint, there's normally an AG, you wouldn't pay a license on the secondary.
So you would have to pay a license on the secondary in our model, but once you add up those costs, you'll find it's still more cost effective than SQL Enterprise.
So at a high level, and I appreciate this complexity here, but at a high level, does that mean that for every enterprise license you're replacing, you'd be replacing 2 standard?
Yes, yeah. But to be fair, we're not replacing enterprise. We're not going to customers and say, right, rip out all your enterprise, replace it with this. We're just giving them another option should they want to start deploying new clusters.
You still have an AG for it?
So we're just replicating the data and integrating that with the failover cluster. It's the failover cluster that's managing the SQL failover and failback. So it's the same concept as AG groups, but it's not an AG group.
So because you've got listener view in a normal SQL AG, so how's that handled?
That is a good question. I'm not technical enough to answer that for you. Yes.
There's no problem. There would be either an elastic IP managed somehow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or, I mean, you can always come to your own solution.
So we protect the IPs within the cluster. That's presented as a virtual IP. We can fail over that IP between availability zones, go away, update root tables, and so forth. That's all managed as part of our solution.
So it's a SIOS provided, as it were.
I wouldn't describe it as a listener. No, it's just we're just providing a virtual IP and protecting that virtual IP. Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. So we're moving away from availability groups. It's our technology. Thank you. Great question, by the way. Thank you very much.